Joining us from Toronto this morning to discuss Libya after Gaddafi. We're joined by webcam by Kamran Bokhari, Stratfor's VP of Middle Eastern and also South Asian Affairs this morning. Kamran, thanks for joining us. What's your reaction upon hearing the death of Gaddafi?
I think the conflict is not over. I think we've moved into a new phase of the conflict. For all intents and purposes, Qaddafi, since the rebels took over the capital, had been relegated to the status of a non-state actor. In other words, his regime collapsed that day. Today, there's sort of a sense of a finality to that. But I think that we're nowhere near a resolution because the road ahead is pretty long, and there doesn't seem to be a roadmap.
Well, Kamran, I also, before I get into the roadmap and talk about this possible, some are saying, power vacuum in Libya, let's talk about the circumstances surrounding Gaddafi's death. There's a lot of questions as to how he was found. He was found alive, and then we know he died shortly thereafter. What are you hearing right now as to the terms and the situation surrounding Gaddafi's death?
I think the way that Qaddafi was killed, and it's really unclear, but it does seem to point to the possibility that this is a undisciplined, disorganized rebel force, which didn't really have a whole lot of intentions of bringing the former leader of Libya to justice through the means that we are familiar with. And therefore, this kind of situation is to be expected. Where someone who was either trigger happy just took a shot, or in fact what the NTC is saying is true, that he was caught in the crossfire. So it's really difficult to say, but I'm not surprised at all at the way things really panned out in the end.
Okay, well, you just said disorganized. I know we have a National Transition Council, but can there be unity when there is this disorganization in the fighting?
That's the biggest concern, because what we have is a leadership council, but it doesn't really have sort of a monopoly over the interim administration that seems to be emerging. In other words, the NTC and the rebel landscape are not synonyms, and they shouldn't be taken that way. The NTC is the largest faction, and it was largely Benghazi-based before the rebels entered Tripoli. And we know that there are other entities like the Tripoli Military Council and other factions that are based out of the Libyan capital and are not going to accept the hegemony of the NTC. And on top of that, you have the ethnic divisions, the ideological divisions, and lots of factions with lots of guns trying to secure their interest in this vacuum that we're dealing with right now.
Well, is this going to turn into something alike and akin to what we saw in Iraq when you removed Saddam Hussein, who some would say, despite how violent and how cruel he was a person who united the country full of different factions? Is what's going to happen and replay in Libya this time around?
If, the Iraq scenario, I look at it and say, okay, it was bad in the beginning, but ultimately the presence of U.S. forces in the country did steer Iraq into a direction where it does have a government. There is a semblance of Iraqi security forces. They may not be the best, but they're not a bunch of a ragtag militias or a ragtag army of fighters. So if it turns out ultimately like Iraq, then that's good. My fear is that, maybe it goes the way of Afghanistan.
It goes the way of Afghanistan, meaning what? That we have insurgents still, the ongoing battles? What do you mean by that?
Well, militias competing with one another for power. When the communist government was overthrown in 1992, between that time and in 1996, when the Taliban took power, we had a militia free-for-all. There was anarchy and chaos because the powers that fought the Soviets and its proxy government, when they were able to succeed and force the Soviets out, remove the communist government, then they started to attack one another because they couldn't agree over power sharing arrangement.
Okay, gotcha. Kamran, thank you so much for your insights this morning. Kamran Bokhari, Stratfor's Vice President of Middle Eastern and South Asian Studies, joining us via webcam from Toronto.